I think this again runs counter to our expectations, counter to our instincts pastorally. I mean, we think that this is the last thing you'd ever want to confront someone with if they're in the midst of suffering. When God's people are suffering in the scriptures, surprisingly, what he confronts them with more often than not is revelation about the future. In fact, it seems that the primary revelation God gives his people while they're facing great difficulties and questions is eschatological. We think, for instance, of these eschatological books, these books that are filled with prophetic imagery, a book like Daniel. Well, how does Daniel begin? It begins in verse 1 with Nebuchadnezzar coming into Jerusalem and taking off these young men and all the vessels from God's temple. And it's in that context of political, military destruction and of theological questions that would be raised by that destruction. It's in the midst of that God then gives this great revelation. You think about the book of Ezekiel, given in a time of exile. Again, this major prophetic book. And you have to ask yourself, would there have been something better that God could have done? Well, perhaps if it were up to us, we would have handled it differently. But that's what God gives his people. You move on to the New Testament and you think about the letters to the Thessalonians, which contain all these truths about the return of Christ. But if you peel back the layer and consider what the Thessalonians were going through, we know from the very outset that was a church that was heavily persecuted, and Paul acknowledges that in his letters. But again, what does God give to the persecuted church? He gives, in large measure, eschatology, and even the book of Revelation, however you understand it, however you work through the various images in it, the reality is it's given to John in the context of exile on the island of Patmos. But interestingly enough, it's not just in the Bible that we see this, it's also in the context of church history. In America, I think it's undeniably the case that the greatest hymns we have about heaven and about the life to come were written by those who were undergoing deep suffering and injustice. And so what we see in the Bible actually is borne out in the context of church history, although it's not what we would instinctively expect.